Julie, welcome to Saltier Politics. It's a new year and it already feels, I think, worse than 2020 in within like 10 days.
No. Well, no,
Let's start low on the pessimism scale.
yeah, it can only get better if we start low, I guess. I don't think it's worse. I mean, look, we have a new Congress coming in. We had Warnock and Ossoff winning in Georgia, which I have to admit I did not see coming. I thought they were not going to be able to pull it off, and they did, which is fantastic. We have a new administration coming in. But I got to tell you, after the events of the past week, if I hear about unity from Joe Biden, I just don't want to hear it. And it's not like I'm looking for retribution. I'm not looking for scalps. We're looking for accountability.
Well, and Biden's theme is America United, and that gave me like oh no. Because again, and we talk about this more later on, but the fact that we need accountability, and that is just signaling where it's just going to be like, let's just unify. Let's forget all of this and put it to the side.
It's been despondent. And I'll tell you what else I'm depressed about. As we're about to tape this, I just found out that our friend Bonnie Watson Coleman, Congresswoman Watson Coleman, a friend of the pod, was just diagnosed with COVID. And why was she diagnosed with COVID? Because she says that she was sheltering during this whole coup attempt on the Capitol with a few members in a very enclosed space who, of course, were not wearing masks. So she thinks that's where she got it. This is a 75-year-old cancer. She just had cancer, by the way, a year or two ago. I mean, this is not 75 years old, cancer survivor, has COVID, thinks she contracted it from members of her own House representatives who refused to wear masks even while sheltering in place. So what's this woman's alternative when she saw that happening? She could have either refused to shelter with them, in which case she could have run back out and gotten potentially lynched by this crazy MAGA mob and been physically harmed, or she could have sheltered in place and gotten sick from COVID. I mean, it's unbelievable what's going on right now.
That was what scared me so much, Julie. I can't believe that she has COVID, but also the fact that how close were we to watching mass executions? Like, what was that line? Like, what if Pelosi was still on the floor when they were there? That's what's so scary to me. Like, just, moments later, like if a lot of these lawmakers weren't hidden, would we have had to witness this on screen?
I guess. I mean, legitimately, I don't know the answer to that, because these people were clearly out for blood. I mean, they said they wanted to hang Mike Pence. Right. How do you think they feel about Pelosi?
Right. I'm like, they see some AOC and some Pelosi, they're going to go like crazy. You don't know.
Listen, members of Congress, Nancy Pelosi certainly does, but rank and file members of Congress, they don't travel with security.
No.
They just, they don't really have most of them don't even have body guys. They just have themselves.
Right. Like, what is Rep. Bonnie Watson Coleman? What is she going to do? Like, when all these people who are armed are coming in, she's going to get out of hiding with the COVID people? No.
Yeah. I mean, exactly right. I don't know. Maybe it's time to rethink security for members of Congress. I mean, you certainly had that horrible situation of that judge in New Jersey whose son and husband were shot. Her son shot to death. Her husband shot by some disgruntled person who appeared before her in her courtroom. And the only safety protocol measures that have been introduced and I think passed now is to keep judges' addresses off the internet. And that's fine. But is that enough for public officials anymore? I don't know what's happening anymore. It's very depressing. And I will tell you, what's really depressing is seeing people that I used to, or still do, interact with on Twitter, who followed me from my Fox days, who were quite rational. I mean, we disagreed on stuff, but they were not necessarily excusing everything Trump did, suddenly begin to drink the Kool-Aid in ways that I just can't believe it.
That's a thing. And something else that made me really I actually started crying because, as you know, the person who I live with is Jewish, and also her grandparents are Holocaust survivors. But seeing that 6SM and E, or whatever that they were wearing on their shirts, the 6 million is not enough.
Yeah.
I just am like, what? That is just complete. I don't even know. Yes. So it's been an emotional roller coaster.
You know what's interesting? I have cousins in Israel, and when we first came to the States, they were very disappointed. They wanted us to go to Israel, and we didn't. And one of them said something to me when I was very little and I was visiting Israel. I was probably 8 or 9. And this is an adult woman. She said to me, you guys will never be safe as Jews. Like, you left the Soviet Union because you're Jews and you think you're going to be safe, but you'll never be safe. You won't be safe anywhere but here. And I kind of laughed it off. I was like, safe here? Are you kidding? This was like during the Lebanon War, It was not exactly, Israel's not exactly the safest place on earth. But the reality is that kind of stuck with me all the time, because you think these are just in the dredges of society, and you think these anti-Semites are just in the dredges of society. And then you see people who excuse this behavior and say, no, it's the Democratic Party that's really anti-Semitic because, something, 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 Charlie Kushner or Jared Kushner, and Ivanka Trump, and something, 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 embassy in Jerusalem. And they don't understand the difference between support of the state of Israel, which is a political construct, and anti-Semitism, which is not necessarily just a political construct. And when you see people openly wearing shirts like that, and it's their right to do that. I mean, I am a big believer in the First Amendment, a huge believer in the First Amendment. So if they want to, put swastikas on their sweatshirts and walk around, that's their prerogative, in my view. But it is jarring to see that these are the people who support not just fringe candidates. They support the President of the United States because something that he has said spoke to them. They don't support Joe Biden. They don't support Barack Obama. They don't support George Bush. They don't support Mitt Romney, or maybe they, I don't know. But they come out of hiding for this guy. And in fact, my good friend Tom Bonnier, who we're going to have on this podcast because it just occurs to me he'd be a great guest, who runs something called Target Smart, which is a huge democratic data company. But he tweeted something out that I thought was so fascinating. He looked up the voting histories of most of the people who got arrested because he's got access to the voter file for the entire country. He looked them up, and they don't have much of a voting history insofar as they did not get political or did not decide to vote until Donald Trump came along.
Wow. That's a lot to break down.
Sit on that for a second. Think about that.
And what's interesting is these are the people you think they hide their hatred in like a basement and have Nazi flag, but it's hidden and it's like the secret that they have. But this was just extremely overt. Like, you can't get worse.
Oh, yeah. And what's fascinating about this is these guys used to tweet. I should remember, again, in 2016. Remember that Trump sheriff star controversy? And, he had the yellow star and that he put out in a mail piece. And he said it was a sheriff star, but it looked exactly like the yellow stars that Nazi would make people wear. And he kind of put that in a mail piece, attacking Soros and all these other anti-Semitic dog whistles. I remember saying that on Megyn Kelly's show, and suddenly I got a rash of anti-Semitic tweets like I don't think I've ever gotten in my life. I mean, I'd never actually gotten any before that. And suddenly it was like the spigot had opened, and in the midst of this 2016 election, I suddenly realized what was happening and how anti-Semitic they were. But what's interesting about them is that was all, anonymous tweets, and you didn't really know who they were. They never really showed their faces. You could be very brave behind a computer screen with an anonymous avatar or no avatar at all. But these people have now come out from behind their computer screens. They're not just tweeting this stuff. They're showing up.
And scaling the walls of the Capitol.
And killing a Capitol policeman who, by the way, was apparently a big Trump supporter. They're, now they're murdering their own supporters. And the president of the United States refused to lower the flags for this man, Officer Sicknick, until I believe today. We're taping this on a Monday. He died on Wednesday. It took him a week to lower the flags.
Which I'm the saltiness is pouring over. I can't.
Well, think about that. I don't even want to talk about what we're salty about this week because It's everything. Because I will tell you this. It's striking to me that the people who talk about Blue Lives Matter, apparently not. Apparently they don't matter. Talked about, Antifa, whoever the hell Antifa is. I still don't know who they are.
They don't exist.
Antifa and Black Lives Matter and riots, and there's riots and this and that. Really? Because what are you doing? Yeah. And some of these people are saying, well, we didn't, we were peaceful marchers. We didn't realize we had crossed the perimeter of the Capitol. We weren't supposed to. I mean, you know who's going to buy that? Somebody who's never set foot on Capitol Hill. It is quite clear where the perimeter of the complex is.
Oh my God. Clear. Yeah. And it's like, I was just an intern and doing, for Senator Mel Martinez, like in 2008, doing tours of the Capitol building. And security was really tight. Like, you were not stepping out of place.
These people showed up with plastic cuffs. Like, they were going to take hostages.
Yeah.
And more importantly, you go to Capitol Hill, you walk into any House or Senate office building, never mind the Capitol itself, you've got to go through a mag machine. Like, you got to take everything out of your pockets. It's like going through TSA if you're going to fly somewhere. You don't just stroll in. You certainly don't. No. Oh, whoops! I didn't realize that I trespassed. There's a mag machine. Did you go through it? Did you put your purse into the machine to see if there's anything in there that shouldn't be in there before you enter this building?
Exactly.
Anyway, on the podcast today, we have our good friend of the pod, Dr. Jason Stanley, a professor at Yale, who is, among other things, and he's one of the most brilliant people I know, if not the most brilliant person I know, but he is the author of several books that really, the reason we wanted to have him on today, he's the author of How Fascism Works, How Propaganda Works, and a bunch of other books. But what's fascinating about Jason is he helps make sense of this from in somewhat apolitical viewpoint, because as we talked about on the podcast today, this to me is no longer having a debate about politics, which is why I've now stopped debating people on Twitter who support Donald Trump. This is not a political debate anymore. It is something much more that requires a psychiatric degree or a sociological degree or a philosophy degree, as Jason has. But he helps us make sense of this in a way that I think is very unique and wonderful. And so coming up, Jason Stanley. Jason, thank you so much for coming back on. And I just want to start with a very simple question for you. I went on Twitter last night and said something that apparently got a lot of people troubled, which is I said that I am no longer going to debate Trump supporters. And my basis for that was I'm not afraid to certainly debate Trump supporters. I've been debating them for, all my years at Fox when Trump was running around on The Apprentice calling Obama a Kenyan-born communist and all, go on, so on and so forth. But it finally occurred to me after the events of last week that I don't have the psychiatric degree to debate them. This is no longer a political debate. This is now something that psychiatrists or philosophers like you or sociologists can better address rather than political consultants or pundits like me. So that's why I wanted to turn to you. Help us make sense of this. Is this a fever that could be politically broken, or is this something more in the annals of fascism, which is, I think we all agree, is the start of what we're seeing right now?
Yeah, so it's not something you can break by debate. It's got to be broken in some other way. It's like, think of it this way. Think of, for a very long time, people thought homosexuality was a disease. Homosexuality was some deep problem. What broke that? It was something different. It was a social movement that got people to fundamentally realize that the way they were looking at the world was incorrect. What we've got now is we've got this crazed, this belief that if you look at it is untethered from reality, that the election was stolen, that Trump won massively. We have it being promoted by people like Josh Hawley, Yale Law School grad, Stanford BA, Ted Cruz, who was the runner-up nationally in the college debate. So these are not dumb people. You're not going to debate Ted Cruz about whether or not Trump won the election. He knows perfectly well that Trump didn't win the election. This lie, or as Tim Snyder just called it in the New York Times, the big lie of the election, it's a myth. It's a founding myth that creates a long narrative that lays down a sort of vengeful political movement, and it's an identity for people. So you have some people who no doubt believe that Trump really won the election, but for many people, it's not like that. It's like Tim Snyder rightfully in the New York Times compared it to the myth that the stab in the back myth that was at the foundation of the Nazi Party, that German Jews and world Jewry betrayed Germany at Versailles. You weren't going to dismantle that myth by arguing to people that the protocols of the Elders of Zion were false, that there isn't, the protocols of the Elders of Zion, the conspiracy theory that Jews controlled the world and were advancing feminism and equality for minorities as a way to undermine white Christian dominance and destroy the nation.
Wait, you're missing my favorite part of the protocols of the Elders of Zion, which is, and I can say this as a Jew, that Eastern European Jews, and I think all European Jews, would kill Christian babies around Easter, which also coincides often with Passover, to use their blood to bake Passover matzah. That's my favorite part of the protocol.
Well, that's blood libel, which far predates the
protocol. But that was
in
the, yes, it was. But that didn't make its way around?
Well, no, that's not really the protocols. There's different. QAnon is a mixture of protocols and blood libel.
Right.
So that's what we're dealing with now. So when we talk about this, and when you talk about debating people, and I respond with, you can't debate people seized by this, and I'm talking about these conspiracy theories, this is not history. It's present, because QAnon mixes blood libel with the protocols. But the protocols really doesn't discuss blood libel.
Let me ask you this. Let me ask you this question, though, because you brought up homosexuality, and I think it's interesting because that, for a lot of people, was rooted, opposition to homosexuality was rooted in religion, right? They found their favorite Bible verse that said that, it's sinful, and so people pointed to a higher authority than, i.e. God, to oppose homosexuality. But when it comes to what we're dealing with now, and movements like this in history, which you've written about really eloquently, it's not really so much about religion. The movement becomes religion, right?
Yeah.
The leader becomes the religious figures. That Donald Trump is the equivalent of the Bible for them, and whatever Donald Trump says is gospel.
Right. So you have, but there's a complex interaction with religions in these far right mass movements. Donald Trump's huge base of support is largely white evangelical Christians. So it's not disassociated from traditional religion. But yes, and one reason that he has so many evangelical followers is they're used to this idea that there's someone who is the sword of God. And for him, he is the sword of God. So religious imagery is all interwoven in it. And like with the 1920s and the 1930s, what they represent the opposition as communists who are as godless communists. They leave the godless Jewish communists out, but but you could see they represent the opposition as godless communists who are going to destroy the traditional family.
And how did this come about? I mean, how is it that he was able to? Is he a symptom? This is what I can't figure out. Is he the disease, or is he a symptom? It seems to me like he's a symptom, that this long predated him and they were just looking for somebody like him.
I think it's both. I think he's an extremely skilled rhetor. He's extremely skilled at the leader-follower, at mass politics, as it's called in the literature. He's extremely skilled at the rallies, at the psychology of the rallies. He's very good at imagery. But he's clearly also a symptom, because this has been paved for a very, very long time by the Republican Party, to be frank. So not every member of the Republican Party, not Mitt Romney, but by forces by America and by longstanding American forces. We have a long history of this. I mean, Henry Ford handed out 500,000 copies of the Protocols of the Elders of Zion. So this whole thing, this idea that there's a cosmopolitan liberal elite who are really seeking world communism backed by the banks and trying to promote race war by getting black people to rise up against white people. So, and then the ultimate goal being communism. This structure is the ideology of the KKK, and it's also the ideology of the Nazi Party. So that is homegrown. The KKK is, of course, homegrown.
So how does this end? Because I'm sorry, Emily, let me just ask this question. Because how does this end? You've done you've studied this, and I'm certainly somewhat a student of history, not to the extent that you are, but to me, the Mussolinis, the Stalins, the Hitlers, these called the Lenins, the cult of personality, it doesn't end in any way except violently, right? I mean, the Soviet Union was overthrown, I guess, peacefully, but after undergoing just 70 years of oppression and violence and death and destruction. Obviously, we know how Mussolini ended. We know how Hitler ended. We know what how people like this typically end. So the question for me is, what will break this fever other than an outright physical violent confrontation, which I guess is what they're spoiling for in some quarters.
Right, they're spoiling for physical violent confrontation, and we've pushed American history. So one thing I think that could give us hope here, that should give us hope, is that this is not some foreign thing. This is America. We're talking about, we need to recognize that there were American fascist movements in the interwar period. The KKK influences Hitler. The ideologies strongly overlap. QAnon is the Protocols of the Elders of Zion plus blood libel. So this is not, it's not some sort of importation from Europe. White supremacist ideology has always held, the KKK was always anti-Semitic. They always said the Jews are leftist communists who are trying to push black people into open rebellion against whites so the Jews can take over. So what stops that? Well, we look at American history, and in American history, it was black American protest that stood up. There was a civil rights movement. It was, they stood up against these forces, and they did social movements that enabled people, decent white Americans to say, wait a moment, we need to address things. And I think what black Americans have been telling us recently is that our law enforcement is filled with white supremacists, that we have a serious far right problem throughout law enforcement in American society, and which results in brutality and things like that. So yet again, we saw Stacey Abrams sign up hundreds of thousands of new voters in Georgia. We saw political mobilization of young people to the polls. That will stop it. We've stopped these forces repeatedly in American history. And when you listen to, frankly, a lot of black Americans, they've been telling us that we have a white supremacy far right problem in this country.
Yeah, no, and exactly to your point is like the data over the last decade has clearly articulated that the threat is from the right. Like even back in 2006, I was just writing about like the FBI produced a report talking about the infiltration of local law enforcement by white nationalists. And then last year in October, an FBI assessment said the same thing, and the Department of Homeland Security, it also said the same thing, that white nationalists are in law enforcement. But so the question is, how do you eliminate them from the system that, I mean, has kind of propped them up for so long and kind of put them together. Now give them weapons too.
Absolutely. So we also post 9/11 created Homeland Security and ICE, novel forces that Trump very cleverly and intelligently turned into his bases of support. So history tells us, there's this debate now, and I'm doing like four interviews this week on this. Do we use the term coup, and what terminology is appropriate? Now you start talking about coup when you have members supporting the coup who are inside law enforcement, inside military, inside various apparatuses of the state. Now, what we know, unfortunately, because the Trump administration told us not to follow this path, we don't know as much as we should about who has these white nationalist far right sympathies in law enforcement branches. But we do know it's a lot of people. So we need to start focusing on domestic terrorism. We need to purge law enforcement of people sympathetic to these beliefs. We need to look at, there was a very good piece by Alex Vitale, an interview with him yesterday, who's a policing expert. And he was breaking down the errors that led to what happened in the Capitol. And he said, look, before any type of protest, the police meet in a meeting, law enforcement meets to assess the threat. And because there's so much white nationalism in law enforcement, they always overestimate the threat when it's Black people or leftists, which is why you have too much violence against them. And then you underestimate the threat, and they vastly underestimate the threat, as we clearly saw, when it's white nationalists. So it was the level of failure of law enforcement that had to be involved for the Capitol to be invaded tells you everything you need to know about failures, into the government's failure to assess correctly this threat.
But isn't it more pernicious than that? Because I'll tell you, and I don't really talk about this.
Julie, not many people tell me, isn't it more pernicious?
That's true. Let me try to out-pessimist you right now, Jason Stanley. You and I have known each other for, 20, 30 years.
Yeah.
This day I'm going to out-pessimist you. I was in Washington on 9/11, and I worked in the Senate that day. And when that plane hit the Pentagon, I was working for a United States Senator at the time, and the Capitol Police immediately ran into our office. We were, I believe, in the Hart Senate office building, and they told everybody to evacuate. And the senator who I was with, for whatever reason, told me to stay with him. He sent everybody else home. We can talk about why he and I apparently had a mutual murder-suicide pact, which I wasn't aware of until that moment. But he wanted me to stay with him, and so they evacuated me with him and the rest of the Senate and the bulk of the House to the Capitol Police headquarters, which is where we spent that day. I don't think I'm giving away any trade secrets because I think it's fairly well known 20 years later that that's where they moved the members for their security. And so I was able to witness firsthand what the Capitol Police is capable of in a real emergency. And I can tell you right now that the Capitol Police is capable of quite a bit. They're not rent-a-cops. They're not, sycophants who just open doors for senators or members of Congress. They're not people who just bust jaywalkers on Pennsylvania Avenue, although some of them are. They are a legit law enforcement force. And so watching this on TV on Wednesday, my first initial thought from that experience was something here is going on that is above and beyond their inability to protect the Capitol. In fact, they're quite capable of protecting their members. That is, in fact, their entire job. And so to me, I don't want to sound conspiratorial, but to me, my initial thought was, what is going on with the Capitol Police? And their entire mission is to protect that complex. And they failed spectacularly in ways that I think are more than just that they were not given help from Homeland Security, or they weren't given help from the FBI, or they weren't given help from whoever they asked for help, the National Guard. Something else was going on that day, and I think we'll find out eventually what was going on. But do you have that sense as well, that there's something about the Capitol Police that day that allowed these people, invited almost these people in?
I think it would be foolish. I mean, unless you think that America is so unique in the world and could never. I mean, in all coups, the president of the United States is calling for a coup. So when the president does that, the president has long been calling, been very cleverly, it's what he's been doing it all in the open. That's one nice thing about President Trump. He's been openly flirting and calling for law enforcement to be his allies, because if you're going to overthrow the government, you need various parts of the government on your side. So how could it not be that there's going to be large portions of law enforcement, military, certainly people in the rank and file who are sympathetic to this? Certainly you saw from the videos, you saw various Capitol Police. I mean, utterly and totally different than being in a leftist protest. I mean, I was in Occupy Wall Street all the time, although I skipped out once they started to kettle people. And the police never made nice with us. There was no sign of any lovey-doveys or Black Lives Matter protests. So on the one hand, you had a number of police who were just helping people. Like how much of that was trying to tame the crowd versus how much of that was just, oh, hey, these are my friends, is unclear. But in moments when a coup threatens, people are making bets about who's going to win, right? And so I sincerely hope that no members of the Capitol Police were thinking, okay, the terroristic mob, that's our side. But certainly there were many people who were supporting the president, who are Trump supporters among the Capitol Police, we know, and that's fine. But the president of the United States was calling to overthrow an election and place himself in power.
But can we wait? I mean, you keep pointing, and you're absolutely right. Emily and I talk all the time about how Black women saved this country, time and time and time again. But with voter ID laws in place, with all the voter suppression going on, it seems like this train is a runaway train, and we're counting on the civil rights movement, a new civil rights movement, to save us. And it seems like they may be going on two parallel tracks, but one is going a lot faster than the other because one is given all the tools to be going at warp speed, and the other is given no tools and in fact is hindered every step of the way.
Yeah, well, you're really giving me a run for my money, aren't you?
I'm really depressed this week. I got to tell you, I've been, I went from being ecstatic over the results in Georgia to just being completely despondent. I guess, Jason, you study this, but I lived it. I'm, as I keep saying, I'm the product of a Russian Jewish upbringing. I've seen this movie before. I've lived in it. My parents certainly have. My grandparents absolutely have. So,
Well, my parents are Holocaust survivors.
Yeah, of course. I mean, you and I can sit here and one up each other about family tragedies all our lives. But I mean, I think maybe that informs my pessimism this week, which is how do we stop this without getting to a violent conflagration? I don't know. So
Gramsci's phrase is pessimism of the intellect, optimism of the will.
Right.
So that's what's really important here. It's absolutely right that we've got a very drastic sign of decline is the fact that we have highly educated, very sophisticated powerful members of the Senate going along with essentially the stab in the back myth, the revenge fantasy, the motivating myth, the election was stolen. We have many QAnon supporters in Congress. Now I'm going along with your pessimistic line. We have many people who are certifiably, we have both the sort of certifiably out there QAnon supporters, and then we have the pure cynicism of a Hawley and a Cruz who know perfectly well what is going on, but are hoping to lead the future movement. So that's terrifying because you have now these people who know exactly what's going on, and they know exactly there's this enormous lie, and they don't care, and they're going to use it in the future for political power. They're going to hope to gain the people that Trump helped radicalize. So how do we address it? Well, one thing I think we've seen that's interesting. I mean, at these moments, everyone's looking to see who's going to win in the end. So it's very important that there's a show of strength against this frankly new movement that's going to arise, the election was stolen movement. So it has to be a very strong response to what happened on January 6th.
What does that look like to you?
Well, we're seeing, so capitalism is complicated because, of course, the oligarchs and the tech titans and everyone, they're going to just go with the winning team. So, as we see in China, as we see they go with who's going to win. But if you have but what we're seeing now is we're seeing people shun Hawley, Cruz, the locking suddenly, because suddenly the tech, I mean, I'm not in favor of tech companies having the power they do. I'm very against that. But, it was so unpopular what happened among so many people that the tech companies decided to unilaterally impose the kind of hate speech regulations that every single other democracy in the world has. So the United States is alone among world's democracies and not having hate speech laws. But what we saw is capitalism take over and impose them. Canada, Germany, Australia, India, they all have hate speech regulations. Now suddenly the private companies are doing that. So I don't think that's a permanent solution. I think all of that should be done by government and not by private companies. But there's a kind of backlash, and the backlash needs to be joined forces of capital, boycotts, that sort of thing.
Yeah, you and I actually disagree on that. I'm a First Amendment absolutist, but I will say I think it's to extend my streak of pessimism today. I think it's fascinating that Twitter waited until Trump was virtually out of the White House. The Republicans had lost control of the Senate, and Joe Biden's about to be inaugurated, to suddenly wake up to the fact that this man has been advocating just awful speech. And I wonder if he had won re-election. And I wonder if he had just decided to rally up his troops to go and attack, I don't know, a Democratic Congress because they voted on something that he didn't like, or they decided to impeach him again, or whatever reason that he would do it, whether these companies would have taken action if he were still in the White House for another 4 years. And my suspicion is probably not. My suspicion is that they are that cynical.
Of course not.
Yeah.
No, that's the problem. No, yeah, I'm not. No, I don't mean to suggest that I don't have any stated view about the First Amendment. I don't know what I think. I think it's complicated because my book, How Propaganda Works, is all about this. It's complicated. The problem of democracy, dating back to Plato's Republic, is free speech. Plato says democracy will lead straight to tyranny because a tyrant will come and split the masses and represent himself as the protector of the people against an enemy in their midst and end democracy. So none of us is going to solve the major problem of democracy dating back 2,300 years. So my view of free speech and democracy is it's complicated. It's the central problem of democratic political philosophy. But you're absolutely right what you just said. When you send the functions of the public sphere and government completely into the free market, that's going to have benefits and that's going to have consequences. The consequences are that those companies are going to do what the bottom line tells them to do, and they're going to look at where the wind is blowing. And if Trump had won, of course they wouldn't have banned him.
Emily, give us the optimistic millennial view. These Xers are about to hang themselves.
Well, I actually kind of, to go with both of your points, Jason, you tweeted out it was a post-Civil War unity that led to calls for Jim Crow. And I think it's interesting, Joe Biden's inauguration theme is America United. So how, after when Biden, assumes office, do we unite, but then also don't take measures that allay this nationalistic crowd and give them certain gives that will keep other people down and suppress them? Like, how do we avoid that kind of fate, like a Jim Crow kind of
Right.
allaying this crowd?
Great question. Great question, Emily. And I don't pretend to have all the answers. So to be clear, calls for unity led to Jim Crow. That was what led to Jim Crow. Like the South, Reconstruction, there were 10 years of Black Americans in the South allowed to vote. And then there was the whites in the South wanted that to end. And there was a presidential election. And as part of the deal that came out of the presidential election, the federal government agreed to remove troops from the South, and that resulted in the end of Black people voting for 100 years, for 90 years, almost a century. So, and it was, and the whole calls where we need to unify after this divisive history. So the problem is you cannot have unity. So there's this slogan, no justice, no peace. Before, you can't just go for peace. The moral of history is you can't just go for peace without addressing the problems that led to it, led to the end of peace in the first place. So what we need to do, so we can't just, if everyone gets like a rose and we don't address the situation that led us here, then the moral that people are going to learn is that there are no consequences. So we can't, when I think Obama made a big mistake in not dealing with torture, for instance, the torture regime. If you're in government, the things we've seen in the last 4 years are truly shocking. I mean, the Bush administration was shocking in various ways, but this is also truly shocking. The response to COVID, the explicit political. Remember in July when it was announced that Jared Kushner's task force decided to back off any national plan because it was mainly Democratic states that were hit.
Yep.
So we all just take it blow after blow because each thing is more shocking than the last. So there must be some accountability. If there's no accountability, then the Hollies and Cruzes of the world are going to learn that you can just take it up a notch further.
That's so important to say, because I've been saying for a while now that Donald Trump is a product of many things. One of them is the failure to hold Nixon accountable.
Yes.
In the 70s, and the fact that Ford, in the quote unquote, to unify the country, as he said, pardoned Nixon for all crimes against the United States, which allowed Nixon to reestablish himself as this, and this is something I did my graduate work on, as this elder statesman, who then proceeded to go on the speaking circuit and write well-received books and become this eminence grise. So did Henry Kissinger, for that matter, which really galls me to no end, but we're talking about Nixon now. This eminence grise of foreign policy and so on and so forth. Meanwhile, zero accountability. So what did that tell presidents going forward? You will have no accountability if you commit crimes against the United States. And this is not a crime against the United States like, whoops, I lied about getting oral sex from my intern.
Yeah. I mean,
this is the real deal. The guy is an insurrectionist who full on promoted a coup against the legislative branch of government, a co-equal branch of government, importantly.
It's still going on. We had over out of it. Yeah. So that's right. And we have, huge numbers of Senate and as you say, the private companies are going to go with whoever's winning. So, that's everyone is now looking who's winning.
After reading your book last time, one of the things that as this was happening really stuck with me is you're like, the moral of history is no one is safe from virulent nationalism. Someone who thinks we are are the ones who are going to fall to it. And that was the whole thing, because so many people are like, this can't happen to us. And the 6th was a very strong shit. It's right. Happening.
That's profound, Emily. That's exactly right. So many things have happened in such quick succession. For someone like Julie, from her background, she understands this because she's Russian. The Russians understand this. The Russians. And so my wife
invented this. I don't know about invented this, but we've been through it.
Yeah, I mean, this is my wife grew up in Kenya. And she's been commenting the whole time when Trump was doing his news things every day for COVID. She's like, "Oh, it's Kenya," when Daniel Arap Moi is on TV every night. And it's very familiar. The coup, the process, post-election process, was very familiar to her. This is very familiar. So the problem is there's a desire, and I've seen this throughout with the reaction to my work. There's a desire not to believe it because it's too frightening to believe. And so with my work, the reaction to my work for years has been, oh, you're being alarmist. It couldn't possibly happen here, and people deny that they're doing American exceptionalism. But it's a natural thing. You don't want to accept that this can happen. Often people don't accept it until it's at their front door. So we have to. What's really important, I think, is to, instead of saying the name of your country, in this case, the United States is my country, our country, say country X, and then describe the events that are happening. That's a good way to understand it, understand the situation you're in. Say, in country X, the president who is calling the election fraudulent. In country X, the president has regularly pardoned Navy elite members of the military who've done brutal things. In country X, the president regularly calls for law enforcement to be more brutal. In country X, etc. And then you can see in country X, this Capitol is stormed. What's going to happen in country X? That's a good way of, because then you remove your own personal connection and you can see the situation as it in fact is.
It's excellent. I will tell you, I've been in Pennsylvania quite a bit over the last couple of months, and what's bizarre to me is driving down the roads there, and I'll end with this. What are we, about 6 weeks past the election? People still have their Trump signs up on their lawns. They have not given up on this. I've never seen anything like it. I mean, it's time to take the signs down, regardless of who you supported. They still have them up, and they have them up proudly as a middle finger to the real outcome of the election, which is that, of course, he won Pennsylvania. Jason, Stanley, thank you so much. We know how busy you are. Unfortunately, fascism is in vogue right now, or the topic of discussing it is. So we know how busy you are. Thank you so much for taking the time to talk to us.
Thank you so much, Julie and Emily. It's always good to talk to both of you.
Take care. Bye.
Thanks. Bye, Jason. I mean, the whole time during what happened on January 6th, I was thinking of Jason's book, because so many of the things he said, that this people thinking that something like this couldn't happen, it did.
It did. And as Jason said to us offline, he wishes that his book was not necessary. How Fascism Works was not necessary, because there would be no fascism. I don't use that word lightly.
No.
At all. But when you have armed thugs attacking the seat of government at the behest of a cult leader who happens to also be the leader of the nation, that's the definition of a fascistic regime that they're trying to accomplish here.
Right. And Julie, can I say one thing we didn't have time to mention, but I remember when Jason, in our first conversation, he was talking about with fascism, you invert things. For example, you respect the flag, and the flag is sacred. But these people who are so-called patriots were walking over these hollowed halls of Congress and just trashing it. And that was another thing in his book that just completely was making my mind just enraged and have smoke.
Yeah. I mean, what's so fascinating to me is there was a tweet that somebody put out. I forgot who it was, but it was such an interesting tweet. And this person said, every time I see somebody with an American flag now, I assume they want to do me harm. Because who are the people riding around with American flags? Probably Trump supporters. Not necessarily. I actually have an American flag out at my country house, but I do that because I want to take it back.
Right. I like that.
But it's fascinating. And by the way, the Confederate flag was run through the Capitol building. That did not happen during the Civil War. They never got to Washington.
That's what was really freaking scary. And again, the fact that friend of the pod, Rep. Bonnie Watson Coleman did not want to leave her COVID-strewn infested room. Like, that's a big reason why not to. Like, what do? It's death or I don't know. Like, what's worse?
Yeah, I mean, there's a great example. Am I going to die now? Am I going to risk dying? Am I going to risk dying now? Am I going to risk dying potentially later? An African-American 75-year-old cancer survivor. I mean, think about if you're Bonnie Watson Coleman. You're a 75-year-old African-American woman. You have seen it all. Yeah. This is, by the way, this is not a shock to African-Americans, what's happening. No. I was shocked. You were shocked. I talked to any of my African-American friends. They're like, welcome to reality, idiot.
Yep.
And they're right. So think about it from her perspective. I have not spoken to her. I don't want to put words in her mouth, but she's not rushing out there thinking, oh, I'll just walk through this crowd quietly. Nobody's going to, do anything to me.
Right. Like just that image of the guy with the Confederate flag walking through the halls is immediately when you said it, these images, and then the noose and all of this, like, where's the representative going to go?
And they hung up Trump flags. I mean, that's what's so amazing. They hung up Trump flags. During the course of this campaign, I keep saying I spent some time in Pennsylvania. The massive, massive Trump flags that would fly from people's flagpoles, not American flags, Trump flags. And what I kept thinking about was, I remember being in Egypt, I want to say, 10, 15 years ago. I spent some time there, not just once. But what always struck me about whenever you'd fly into Cairo back in those days is from the airport into the city and everywhere, not just there, but immediately, there were pictures on flags, pictures, billboards of Hosni Mubarak, who was the president of Egypt at the time, an autocrat, obviously, and a despot who eventually got overthrown. But you had young Mubarak, and then middle-aged Mubarak, and then older Mubarak, like all these different pictures of Mubarak. And then when growing up in Moscow, I remember, of course, everywhere you went, you saw these pictures of on flags everywhere, of billboards and flags everywhere of Marx, Engels, and Lenin everywhere. Marx, Engels, Lenin, Marx, Engels, Lenin. My mother tells me that was the case when Stalin was alive, when she was a little girl. You have placards of Stalin everywhere. It was a cult of personality. You don't have that here, or you didn't have that here, right? You didn't have Obama flags or Clinton flags or Bush flags or Ronald Reagan flags flying from people's flagpoles.
Right.
You didn't replace the national symbol, which is either the flag or we have myriad symbols that people can put up, with a cult of personality. But you do in these autocratic countries. You do. And I'm fairly well traveled. I know you are too. I mean, you go to England, you don't, they have the Queen, which is kind of symbolic. She doesn't really have any power, but you don't have placards of Boris Johnson, or you don't, Emmanuel Macron in France. But you do in these autocratic countries. And that says something. And it's, and here as well, Trump flags on the Capitol. Not American flags, Trump flags.
And it just shows you how fragile our democracy is.
These people need to be held to account. Okay. And we can have, this call for unity. Until the fever is broken, there can be no unity, because the unity that they would accept is only their worldview. And if you're Donald Trump, it's never enough. It's never enough. Mike Pence was the biggest sycophant on earth. Even that wasn't enough. Fox News, biggest sycophants on the planet. Not enough for him. It is never enough. He is the beast who constantly needs to be fed. And if you give him an inch, he will take a mile. And there's no amount that will satisfy him or satiate him. So there can be no unity with people until this fever breaks. There needs to be account, and there needs to be accountability. He needs to be held to account. And not just him. That disgusting video, I don't know if you saw it, of Donald Trump Jr., this video of him and his girlfriend and Ivanka and the president and the chief of staff to the White House, all of them just watching this from some makeshift situation room in some tent, having like a family party, watching this.
You mean evidence of promoting and supporting an insurrection?
I mean, what the hell is this family doing there anyway? And threatening people if you don't support us, if you're not going to be with us, we're going to come for you. I'm going to personally come for you. There can't be unity with people like that.
Mm-mm.
Anyway, on that happy note, we have a great bunch of guests lined up for the first couple of months of this podcast, which I'm really excited about.
Me too. I'm excited. That's what I'm looking forward to. I'm looking forward to our next interview and having these amazing conversations.
I agree. All right. Happy New Year. So wonderful to see you in 2021. Just so you know, I baked your favorite cake last night. You were supposed to come over and you didn't, but I baked it anyway. It's here and it's not going to be eaten by you, but I will bake you one the next time you guys come over. Again, that is a chocolate tahini cake.
Oh my God.
That everybody on the planet should know how to bake because it's so good. Okay.
Oh.
Bye.
All right. Bye.
Bye.